I said to myself, this is unacceptable. And then I started doing some research, and I found to my absolute horror that Assam has the worst maternal mortality ratio in India. 490 women at that time died in childbirth out of 1 lakh deliveries. Bihar was 390. Today, Assam still has the worst maternal mortality ratio, it's 320, the best improvement in a state in the last 10 years, and Bihar is below 300. I say this because I share with you the concept that the idea that the state in many parts of this country, especially on the islands of the Brahmaputra, is conspicuous by its absence. Whether it's in terms of services or in terms of delivering meeting the basic needs of people and delivering these rights. So at that time I had this concept of designing a boat clinic that would take health care to people, because instead of people coming from the service, I said the service should go to them. We started in one boat, we won an award from the World Bank for innovation in bridging rural gaps. We started with one boat and 5 people. Today we have 15 boat clinics traveling on the rivers of the Brahmaputra, the waters of the Brahmaputra, and we've reached 20 lakh people with healthcare. That's 2/3 of the population on islands. Now, we have a partnership with the stakeholder, the principal stakeholder, the National Health Mission. Why I talk about this is that the next story is in a way a closing of the first part of the circle. A few years ago, once these boat clinics were functioning, one of them was returning from a distant area to home base, Dibrugarh. And they found on the way back in the evening a couple waving to them from a small island holding a child. And they came in, and obviously there was some problem. And they saw the child was in acute distress. Her face was turning blue, acute upper respiratory distress. And they had the right medicines. The child was saved. Within a few minutes she was better, and they gave her medications, but the doctor had an interesting question to the man. He says, "You seem to be waiting for us. How did you know we were coming?" He says, "I've been watching you for 3 years. If you go on this route of the Brahmaputra, you come after 5 days. You go on this route, you come after 3 days." And this was the 3rd day. So the child started deteriorating on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, she was critical, extremely critical. And to me, that is a statement of amazing trust, that once a service reaches people, if it's sustained, whether the state exists or not, they have trust in the service, in the outreach, and in the small interventions that can save lives. And I always say this, that you save a mother's life or a child's life, you save a world. I'll stop there and then we...
Thank you. I think one of the dilemmas in the humanistic disciplines which we all face is the separation very sharply of the world of ideas, which sometimes tends to be clinical, from the emotional realities of life. And it's very inspiring in a small but very significant way that you've pinpointed something of great significance. So the issues we are debating, and I think the various scholars here embody that in their own very specific personal ways. These are issues of great significance for people who live in the Northeast and for others who have different kinds of links with them. Just wanted to flag this by putting a question to Willem, that when you think of these large words, governance, connectivity, conflict, what is it that you think is missing in the way that we look at them?
I think we had a fantastic conference with a lot of new ideas and sort of process that needs to be continued. But I was also struck by the fact that we're all still living in the shadow of partition, and that when you talk about Northeast India, the areas around Northeast India have disappeared. Yesterday, one of the participants from Burma said, Burma is invisible in your discussions. And I can say the same about Bangladesh. It's just not there. And this is not something only here. When I'm at a conference in Bangladesh, Northeast India doesn't exist. When I'm at a conference in Burma, Northeast India, let alone Bangladesh, doesn't exist. And I think that's a big problem. First of all, because 70 years ago, this was one big region without borders. Second, there are lots of things going on across the region that you miss if you don't look at these different parts of partitioned South and Southeast Asia together. Maybe I can give a small example. One of the several insurgencies against the Indian state that occurred in Northeast India, the Mizoram insurgency or the Mizoram War of Independence or the Guha or whatever you want to call it, is always understood in terms of Delhi against Mizoram. But if you take a bit larger sort of approach, you can see that there were 4 wars going on in the period in which this revolt occurred, 1966 to 1986, that are all connected. And the Mizo revolt couldn't have developed the way it has developed if it hadn't been able to connect with these other revolts. The first is the Bangladesh Liberation War. The headquarters of the Mizo revolt moved to East Pakistan, the Chittagong Hill Tracts, and attacked Indian armed forces from there. They were protected by the Pakistan government. And when the Bangladesh Liberation War broke out in '71, they found that the area they were in remained completely under Pakistani control till the end. So they continued what they'd been doing before then. Then suddenly in December '71, the Pakistan power crumbled, and the Mizos were without their guardians, their protectors all of a sudden. They had to run away because the Indian armed forces were coming into the country and the Bangladesh Liberation, the freedom fighters were after them as well. So they escaped to Burma, to Arakan or Rakhine state. There they entered, no problem about borders in these regions at that time, you just crossed. But there they didn't deal with the...
Just keep speaking.
Yeah, sure. With the Burmese government, because the Burmese government was not in power in northern Arakan at the time. The area was controlled by the Communist Party of Burma, and they protected the Mizos for a while. Then, after some time, they were allowed back into Bangladesh by a new government in Bangladesh that came in '75, and that had a problem at its hands because now there was a rebellion in the Chittagong Hill Tracts against the Dhaka government, and they wanted to use the Mizos against that local war. So if you don't see these wider linkages between, in this case, Bangladesh, India, and Burma, you don't really understand how this whole historical process happened. And similarly, there are links with China, with Burma, and so on, that we need to take into account to understand things in the past, but also today. And as we were talking about earlier, this whole region is changing very rapidly, and the geopolitics around the region are changing even faster. So if we are not able to departition our minds quickly, we will not be able to understand what's going on around us.
Thank you. Professor Misra, I was just wondering while listening that one tends to forget this time 70 years ago when British power was dominant also ended with wars, and Northeast India, parts of Northeast India and Burma saw, we all know, three very large armies, the British and British Indian, the American and Japanese. There was the fourth we tend to forget, which is the Chinese. So there's a long history of conflict. And how do you see that playing out now? Because sometimes these conflicts take an extremely sharp form, even with peoples who have had a long history of close association. Sometimes close association provides the basis for coexistence of different sorts. But it may also be a time when it breaks down into very sharp conflict. And you've tracked this for a very long time.
Mahesh, you are referring primarily to relations with the other countries.
Well, they're not really separable. That was, I think, one of Willem's points.
Willem has said the interconnectivity of the entire region. I would like to begin with, again, what he said about the partition, first of all, because I've been working a little bit on that. I think 1947, August 15 was a very important day for us. So it was not equally important for several other small nationalities in the region. Geographically, it was very important because we were part of a wider landmass, and suddenly you become very landlocked. And when you become landlocked, I think other problems also crop up, And when I talk of the frontier or of the borderland or of security measures on the part of the government of India, the whole perspective changed. And even when it came to capital investment, building up of industries, I think there was a lot of second thought about whether it should be done in undivided Assam at that time, which was largely what is the Northeast today. So naturally, the question arose even in the Brahmaputra Valley, which had long centuries of interaction, cultural and otherwise, with the rest of the subcontinent. Questions arose as to whether we should look east or we should look west to India. And in many of the documents that you go through, documents produced by the United Liberation Front of Assam, the attempt is made to prove that, yes, we are more South Asian than we are Indian. That tendency, as I said, it's again to be traced to the geographical developments that took place, that we are too far from India. But that reality didn't work out as far as parts of Northeast is concerned. And I feel that when you talk of broader issues or issues about relationships with Pakistan initially, then with Bangladesh, or relationship with Myanmar. Myanmar hasn't figured very importantly, excepting for say when you talk of Naga politics, it was very important. When you talk of alpha bases in Myanmar, it becomes relevant. It becomes very relevant in the context of insurgency. Otherwise, from the point of view of trade, a lot of rethinking is being done, opening up is being done, Moray and other places. But still, it figures primarily from, as far as the government of India is concerned, as far as the state governments are concerned, I think a lot of thought about Myanmar comes in because of insurgency in the entire region. About Bangladesh, I think there's been a change of perception, fortunately. And there's a lot of importance on opening up trade routes, on opening up the Brahmaputra. And I think there's been a slightly positive response also from Bangladesh in recent times. But what I feel actually is very important is that trade is not just between governments. Trade is between peoples. And there's where people's perceptions become very important. And the average perception of the average citizen in, I think, entire Northeast regarding Bangladeshi infiltration needs to be, changed. And that is where, I think some real hard homework needs to be done when you come to change of perceptions. But otherwise, I think the problem still remains as far as land and immigration and occupation of tribal areas, reasons why you had the problem in Bodoland, which was not at all just between a particular two religious communities or two groups as it was made out to be in many other parts of India and also in the social media. It was primarily basically a problem related to ethnicity and land and so on, pressure on land. So when we talk of China, I think I can't speak about Arunachal. I still feel there's a lot of very strong feeling for India in Arunachal. But Arunachal always had very strong links with across the border. And naturally, we need to accept that instead of building up a bogey against China. I think the times are definitely changing now. But one very important point about Arunachal is that I don't want to use the word integration, but when you move around and talk to people, I feel there's a lot of belief or whatever you say in the present system of governance that has emerged through representative democracy. That's extremely important to note. But as far as Assam was concerned, it still nourishes that memory of 1962, when I feel there's a lot of misreading also of Nehru's statement, of his very controversial broadcast about Assam in 62 October. I still remember listening to it as a high school student. When the Chinese troops occupied Bomdila and were just overlooking Tezpur. But at that same time, which I've always referred to as the paradox of the Assamese mind, there's always a feeling that we have not been treated properly. The sense of being betrayed. The sense of being betrayed comes only when you have sense of faith in someone. You believe in someone and someone betrays you. That's what happened at the grouping time, when the grouping took place. And that also happened, and that's why I always feel that there is a great pull towards India. Even at the height of the Assam movement, the main slogan, despite all the aberrations and violence that accompanied it, was "Save Assam today to save India tomorrow." That was the slogan. We should not forget it. So even in Bhupen Hazarika's songs, at the height of anti-Indian feeling in 62, feeling of being abandoned to the Chinese, that was a very common feeling everywhere. And I still remember a lot of people, many of school teachers working in schools in Shillong, they just disappeared overnight. They thought that Assam would go under occupation by the Chinese. Even in Guwahati University, there were so many vacancies suddenly that later on when I joined the Department of English, two of my best teachers always used to say that we came from Karnataka because there were so many vacancies after 62, because people left. So that was the point. But at that point too, Bhupen Hazarika sang those two beautiful songs, eulogizing the sacrifice of the Indian soldier. These are two very, very moving songs by Bhupen Hazarika. So there's a pull towards India, and there's an anger that at moments of crisis, India has dumped us. That feeling is there. So I think as far as China is concerned, I don't think there is much of a problem. With Bangladesh, of course, the problem of migration or illegal migration or whatever you call it needs to be worked out at the diplomatic level as well. And with Burma, of course, I think relations between bordering regions of Burma are quite very clear. I think we don't have a lot of problems that way. So that way, I don't think, I would see very positively, I think. And the largest positive point would be about Bangladesh, that if we open up the Brahmaputra as the major, riverway across, then I think the problems of transit and all would be met to a very great extent. And this time, of course, that huge plant that has come up in Tripura, funded by the ONGC for power generation, most of the very heavy equipment actually went through Bangladesh by the river. So the river transport part, the opening up part is very important, but for that also, I think people's perceptions need to change. So that's all.
Ram, both Professor Misra and Professor Willem and Schendel focused on humans and changing relationships, borders, identities, conflicts. But it's striking with the Chakmas, one of the initial impulses for disaffection is displacement by a dam. And of course, with the Mizos, we are all, no one in this room needs to remind of the links of bamboo, rats, and famine. So given the enormous richness of this region in terms of its natural wealth, its biological diversity, its ecologies, how do you see the issue of connectivity? Because we are living through a period when we are told in India, look east is giving way to act east. Burma has opened up. China is a very major player in terms of capital flows. There are other countries like Japan which play a role. So how do you see the natural landscape or the natural setting in which these transformations happen? Because you've worked on the environmental issue for a long time as a historian.
Yeah. Thank you, Mahesh. It was fascinating listening to the two previous speakers. I, you know, you can look east, which is the point that both Willem and Udayon made, and look at cross-geographical and historical boundaries. Or you could look west towards and confine yourself within the boundaries of the nation state. So they're complementary views. They're not exclusive. So I don't think Willem was saying that by looking at cross-border interactions, one should forget about the interaction of the 7 states with the other 22 states of India. So in that spirit, I'll take that. And I'll look at this interaction between these 7 states, or 8 states, with the rest of India. And there's historically, that is since 47, if I was to look at it as a historian of the people, the ecologies, and the cultures confined by the national boundaries of India, and I was to take the 7 states of the Northeast and the rest of India, there are 3 asymmetries at work. One is a political asymmetry. And Udayon's statement about feeling betrayed, because you had a hope and you were betrayed, shows a political asymmetry. Now, this sense of either being betrayed or of not having faith at all in the intentions of the Indian nation state, which is the case in Mizoram and in Nagaland and in parts of Manipur, which is why those are 3 states where you've had major insurgencies against the Indian state. So there's this asymmetry, there's a political asymmetry, and it's interesting to see how this can be, changed. I mean, there have been some successful peace processes, as in Mizoram, but say in Assam and Manipur, the conflict goes on. It's interesting to think again comparatively, not just with regard to our neighboring countries, but globally. Should we have moved towards a system where smaller states had equal representation in the upper house of parliament, for example, which is the case in America, where smaller states are protected because they have 2 senators. Now, one of the reasons there's a political asymmetry is that in a Lok Sabha election, these votes don't count. I mean, each of these states has 1 or 2 MPs going to the Lok Sabha, whereas UP has 78 and Maharashtra has 50 something, so they are much more important. So there's a political asymmetry to consider. Then there's the cultural asymmetry, which is to do with misrecognition, condescension, a patronizing attitude towards people from the Northeast, as manifested most recently in the manifesto of a leading party in Delhi. But it's much wider than that. It's not just one party. It's all parties. It's the sense that हमसे अलग हैं, they're different from us, they're more akin to the Chinese, so this kind of thing, which has resulted in attacks on students from the Northeast, including in my hometown Bangalore, and of course in Delhi and elsewhere, and it's a major issue that needs to be tackled. So there's the political asymmetry, there's the cultural asymmetry, and I'm going to come in the end to what Mahesh alluded at, the ecology and natural landscape of the Northeast, and argue that there's also resource asymmetry at work, where the Northeast has been implicitly treated as a resource catchment for the rest of India. And this goes back to the 19th century. It's not only a post-colonial phenomenon, of course it's a colonial phenomenon. You have the forests of Assam, then of course tea, displacement of people and destruction of forests to cultivate tea, then you have oil, and of course post-47 this accelerates with coal, limestone, uranium, and most recently hydropower. So this is I think something where you need to really look very seriously at, is the Northeast being treated as a resource catchment for the rest of India? Is the Indian growth story, which is celebrated and talked about, partly dependent on massive exploitation of the resources of the Northeast? And before I say a little more on this point, allow me to quote Gandhi, because yes, somewhere Gandhi has some relevant things to say about this. And I'm going to read you 2 quotes from Gandhi. One is from December 1928, where Gandhi says, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West." Now, I'd like to gloss the after the manner of the West. He's not saying India should not take to industrialization. He's saying, God forbid that India take to industrialization in the manner of the West. Then he says, the economic imperialism of England is keeping the world in chains today in 1928. England is a single tiny nation. If a nation of 300 million, which is what India was in 1928, takes to similar exploitation, it will strip the world bare like locusts. Now, this is Gandhi in 1928. Around the same time, he said in another speech, he said, to make India like England and America is to find some other races and places of the earth for exploitation. to make India like England and America is to find some other races and places for exploitation. But since the Western nations have already divided the known races outside Europe for exploitation, and there are no new worlds to conquer, what can be the fate of India trying to ape the West? Now, well, if you try to ape the West and you adopt a similar capital-intensive, resource-intensive energy model of industrialization, you have to find new worlds to conquer. I mean, if you look at China, they found Tibet, they found Xinjiang, they moved into Africa. If you look at India, the real catchments are the central India and the northeast. And these are also both conflict zones. Now, in central India, the conflict is directly being caused from the 19th century. Central India, which is the Adivasi belt of central India, which is a region I know much better than I know the northeast. There have been three waves of exploitation. It was first forests, then it was dams, and then finally it was mines. And there have been, one of the major tribal rebellions in the 19th century, early 20th century, were forests. Then you had issue of dams, the Narmada Andolan, and now, of course, you have the whole mining question. I mean, in Orissa, for example, arguably, there were no Naxalites till the mining boom. In Orissa, and now, of course, you have several districts that I just described and so on. So I think this is a question, there's a history of misunderstanding, misrecognition, and conflict between the Northeast and the rest of India based on political and cultural asymmetry. And now you may have a resource asymmetry which has the potential for accelerating. So I'm flagging this. One of the few Indian politicians to recognize this was Jairam Ramesh when he was Environment Minister. And he attended a meeting in Guwahati on large dams and the implications, and he made a statement and he wrote to the Prime Minister. And following this, there were a series of attacks on him in the Indian press, even suggesting that he was consciously or unconsciously an agent of China. Now, this is extraordinarily disturbing. Now, part of it is just plain ignorance. Part of it is xenophobia. Part of it is corporate control of media. But part of it is ignorance. Ignorance in that the sense that we can ape Western models of industrialization. The West has done it, we have done it, and we want this. And naturally, people who are poor want to become middle class. People who are middle class want to become rich. People who ride cycles want to ride motorbikes. People who ride motorbikes want to ride cars. And we did, of course, safe housing, clean drinking water. They are aspects of development which everyone in India needs. But the choice is sometimes falsely posed between keeping people allegedly as museum pieces in a zoo. Tribals, you want to make them in a zoo, or allowing them to join the great Indian dream. But the great Indian middle class dream may in fact be a utopia, a fantasy, an unachievable dream. And I think in the case of the Northeast, the political asymmetry and the cultural asymmetry, which has led to misrecognition, misunderstanding, conflict, if it is intensified by resource asymmetry, this is a major question which certainly not just the decision-making people, but the Indian media has and perhaps even Indian intellectuals have not paid adequate attention to. I mean, if you look at, of course, it has many costs. I mean, if you look at Arunachal, which Udayon mentioned, and Arunachal is the state in the Northeast I have the most second-hand knowledge of, because I wrote a biography of Varier Elvin, who spent many years in Arunachal. But if you look at the cultural and aesthetic costs of development, so-called development in Arunachal, they're visible. And of course, economic and political costs will also follow. So I think these are questions which I hope, are taken seriously, are reflected upon, that, the factories of Bangalore and Bombay will be running on power from Arunachal, but is any of the power reaching the villagers there? Is there real distribution of benefits from... So again, the last point I'd like to make, since I invoked Elvin. Elvin was mistakenly called an isolationist. And he wrote a famous rebuttal to this in the 1940s, which was called, "Do we really want to keep people in a zoo?" And I think the important thing is, as again, if I may invoke Elvin, if you look at his philosophy of Nefa, where you argue that, that people must be allowed to retain their rights over land, over forest. Udayon talked about forest conflicts. They must be granted the right to develop too, but not at the cost of their ecology, their culture and tradition, and at a pace and with enough political control over the process of development, which the asymmetry in our political system currently doesn't allow.
Willem, you talked about conflict quite significantly, and it's interrelation. I just want to flip the question because I'm very struck that, the Mizo Accord dates to 87. The Naga peace process, that's the word normally used, will soon complete 20 years. There's even a dialogue with ULFA. We have not seen a similar kind of breakthrough in Burma, but it's widely expected that because the Burmese political system is at least moving towards engagement rather than repression of democratic elements, we may see such changes there. So given this, I mean, how does your view of the nation state play out? Are nation states capable of being more rather than less accommodating? Or is this not really accommodation? Is it simply playing for time? How do you see this? Because when one looks back, 20, 30 years is a very brief moment historically, but for the people living through it. I was just thinking of, because you talked about these camps and how if someone spent 20 years in the armed conflict in the jungle and has been in peace talks for 20 years, presumably they're also changing as people. It's not just the people, the bureaucracy or the politicians on the other side of the table. So how do you see this? Do you see these nation states, and you refer to Bangladesh, Burma, India, do you think they can be more accommodating or can be more open? And needless to say, while these processes of dialogue may not directly link to the neighboring state, it does help. So I'm sure that India, Bangladesh having better relations creates a better situation for dialogue, etc., with the region.
Well, maybe a way to look at the Northeast India, is to think of Bangladesh and Burma also having their northeasts.
Sure.
In Bangladesh, it's the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
Sure.
In Burma, it's all the regions around the Central Valleys,
Sure.
Inhabited by non-Burmans. And you see, in those cases too, there is a history of peace agreements, some of them successful, most of them not. When you look at peace agreements, it's always a question of time before they explode again. If the issues that Ramchandra Guha mentioned are not dealt with, it's just a stopgap thing. It's also interesting so in order to get a better view of the Indian case and to judge success or not, it's also important to realize that these post-partition fragments have very different policies concerning ethnic minorities, in that you don't have a fifth or sixth schedule in Pakistan and then in Bangladesh. The idea of indigenous people is rejected in all three countries, basically, by the government. And yet these narratives churn around and become more powerful. The question of dams was already, you mentioned the dam in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. What you see there is, this was a dam that was constructed in around 1960.
That's right.
And it took a long time for a real movement, a resistance movement to develop. We now have lots of dams being planned and some being executed in the Northeast. You can learn from the experiences in Bangladesh to see that there is often a time lag, even if you now have a lot of contestation. Once the dam is there, that's not the end of the story. It will take a long time to work its way through society. So I think, again, looking at these different examples is very, very interesting. And for example, in Kachin state in Burma, the Chinese were going to create a major dam, and have now, the Burmese government has now decided not to go ahead with it. It's very important, I think, to study the reasons why this happened there and see to what extent the processes around, say, Arunachal dam building and so on are similar or distinct. I think you get better insight in these processes if you look at them across these borders.
I was wondering, this process of accords often has led to power sharing, but over the last few years, you've been one of those who's argued that sometimes this notion, whether within a state, within a nation state, regional, sub-regional level, can lead to new forms of exclusivism. And I think in a very important memorial lecture, you recently argued also that there are questions of rights, and the notion of homeland, significant as it is, can release certain forms of ethnicity, which can raise doubts about where we're heading. So would you like to sort of raise this? Because I think these are actually interrelated.
Actually, thank you so much for bringing up this matter, because this is very, I think it's a very serious issue for people not only in the Northeast but also in the rest of the country to ponder upon, the whole question of citizens' rights in ethnic homelands. It's true that we have had the first major challenges to the Indian nation state. If you leave aside Kashmir, I think you have the longest insurgency in the Northeast, perhaps not only in India but in Asia. But out of that, so much has emerged, and I was discussing this also in this morning's presentation, that given the resilience of the Indian Constitution, we have gone a long way. As you said, Willem, there is no sixth schedule in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh government's relationships with the Chittagong Hill tribes has also been a very contentious and very difficult one. And we who have seen the camps in Tripura of the Chakmas, we realize. But saying that the Indian Constitution has been resilient to a great point in accommodating small nationalities that were not even part of the national struggle for freedom, which is, I think, not a very small achievement. It's a very big achievement. And even when you take up very small tribes, consisting of a few thousand people in the Northeast, you still, it's quite amazing that they have retained their indigeneity in many senses, in cultural patterns, forms, and I think Meenakshi is the best person here to tell us about that, about the Thangsas. Now, given that, I think the creation of political spaces, the relationship between ethnicity and territory has been a very, very difficult one, because people have always lived side by side, people have always moved into one another's territories. You take the best example perhaps would be the Kukis. They were wandering tribes. So when you came to the Kuki-Naga conflict, that was the biggest challenge, where do you pin down people on territory? So when this whole idea of autonomy transgressed boundaries of cultural autonomy into territorial autonomy, and the Indian nation state thought at a particular point that it would be easy to, create political spaces for some of the major communities. And in the process, a whole, situation has been created, where you overnight create a large segment of people who become, who do not have equal rights with the others when it comes to reservations in legislature, when it comes to the right to fight elections. That is one aspect. I think that has not been at all addressed when it comes to citizens' rights in ethnic homelands. It has been an area of silent voices, as I said. The second one is, again, I think, about traditional structures and about the whole idea of representative democracy that has come in. And how do traditional structures and the community come into clash with the right of the individual, which has also not been addressed. So I think these are very important issues which need to be addressed. Particularly, I feel this has attained an urgency because of the recurrent violence that has been taking place. We get accustomed to violence from the 90s to the present time. And I had the experience of visiting some of the camps very recently. So it's very recently etched in my memory. And I feel that the whole question of citizens' rights needs to be revised in a very big manner. That's what I feel. It needs to be addressed. What are the forms it would be addressed is, of course, it needs to be worked on.
I think the distinguished journalist scholar who wishes to say something, and I think he should.
No, I actually want to pick up on what Udayan's been speaking on, because you have essentially these accords are good examples of manufactured consent, where small groups of people have been meeting to find a common agenda, something that they can each can be comfortable with, not too uncomfortable with, And I'm reminded of one of the scholars in the morning session. He was presenting, Jayanta Tamule, he was presenting this story from Eastern Kires, a village remembers. where the underground group has come to an agreement. And a village woman talks to these guys who've surrendered and come over ground and says to them, when you asked for food, I fed you. When you asked for my son, I sent him to the jungle. When you've come to this, did you ask me anything? So, and if you look at all the accords that have been signed and re-signed and redesigned and rebuilt or broken, none of them are based on any fundamental research. They're all based on perceptions by the state and central governments and in conversations with their intelligence and the military on one side, as well as the strongest armed force on the other. So there is very little in terms of real negotiation that takes place on real issues. And again, a part of the manufactured consent means the arms are never truly surrendered and arms are never decommissioned. So you have the Northeast, which is, you can call it the graveyard of accords or a place where accords are plentiful, but the scale of weaponry that exists now is far larger than ever existed in its, perhaps in its history. Those are 2 points I wanted to give, and I think that this, what this has done is actually reduce the space for actual negotiation and conversation, because you have continuously groups that break away challenging the one that, quote, sold out. So the perception of who is the authentic, who speaks for the people. They speak for nobody except for themselves, the armed groups, because nobody's actually asked them to do this. So I think this is something that needs to be looked at. And in the process, we've talked at various times about the act east, look east, whatever this thing is, the strange animal is. A Burmese friend was saying the other day, you've been looking for 20 years. Now you know what we look like. We know what you look like. What is the time to do something? But can you have such a policy which is premised on an open society, which is premised on the fact that you need development, when you're raising 50 battalions to police the Manipur border which you're going to fence? That means a cost, according to an army person, it's going to cost 15,000 crores. So what are you actually saying? What are you trying to do? Are you going to have a look-east policy? Or are you going to create a situation where essentially people live within borders and are controlled within borders? It raises another point, which is that, and I close here, which is that will anybody in his right mind come to an area like the Northeast to invest anything? I mean, you have, by the government's own admission, it's been disturbed for 50 years. You'll have an advertisement on television saying paradise on earth. Oh yeah, you've got the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Disturbed Act, the Indian Army, the BSF, name it, you've got it there. So who's going to buy that?
Ram, I want to tie these together for you in a different way. Just wondering, what very senior historian who's very distinguished, who I won't name, is off record, one day said in passing conversation that India and the United States are unique. India has not had a full-scale war on its territory since the 1850s, and the US hasn't since the 1860s. So if you look at large nation states, particularly, if you look at Russia, China, they're not comparable. No, this is strictly speaking not true. We now know from new emerging work on the Second World War that not only is a lot of it fought in Burma, it has huge implications for the Indian economy, Indian polity, culture, society, and nowhere more clearly than in the Northeast. And it does occur to me that, you spoke of shadow of partition, but if you look at, those two fat books, Forgotten Wars, Forgotten Armies, you sort of plow through them carefully. The two things clearly happening during the Second World War. Certain groups whose lands become the amphitheater of conflict, become actors in the conflict. So the Nagas and the British is one example, the Kachin and the Karen another. In the process, surely some of those societies also do get militarized. And these areas figured in certain very important ways in the options available in the 40s. So the crown colonies and so on. So I just want to turn this round to Ram. I mean, are we ignoring the shadow of the longer period of empire. I mean, even the 5th, 6th schedule, these accords, these also go back to a very long imperial colonial period. We may be doing them in a republican democratic polity. So, what is the longer term picture when you look at the socio-politics of this region in terms of the imperial aftermath, the impacts of the Second World War? It's not so long ago historically, very long ago for people in this room perhaps.
You talked about militarization, and of course Sanjoy also mentioned it. I'll come to that, but just a minute, I want to pick up on something what Udayon said. I think, I like, one of the things I appreciate about Udayan's comments, both his original comments and what he said later, was that there is an element of optimism, not unthinking optimism, but when he talks about Arunachal, Assam, that and also the Indian Constitution, there is space. I mean, if you look outside the Northeast, you forget that they were in mainstream India, at least, and you forget Kashmir also, it's so-called mainstream India, very much part of the national movement. There are two regions which have witnessed major secessionist movements. Punjab is one, and the other one is Mahesh and my native state, Tamil Nadu, which is not violent, but where the major political party till 1963 did not accept the Indian Constitution. So I think there is space, there is hope. Some of those legal instruments, even if they have a colonial origin, like the 5th and 6th schedule, can actually be used intelligently, but that would require great imagination, from both all kinds of negotiating parties. So that what Sanjoy said, that there's an accord signed between the New Delhi and a particular group, and some fragment says we don't accept that. So that's a question. But I think one should not be, it's not absolutely bleak. And I think a qualified optimism is something that, at least in the long sweep of history, because as Mahesh mentioned, 70 years is nothing, 30, 60, I mean, if you look at how European nation states were built and how much blood was spilled in creating the European nation states. So the war that Mahesh mentioned in the US, the Civil War, had, say, 10 million dead people. So I think there are ways in which you can, think imaginatively and courageously in resolving these conflicts. But the question of militarization, I listened to Udayan speak and to Sanjoy speak, and I was thinking of my own rather, as a very elementary knowledge of the Northeast. I wanted to just pose a question here about gender and conflict. Okay. Now again, I speak here as someone who knows very little about the Northeast, except through secondhand, through historical documents. But it's arguable, I'm not saying it is certain, but it's arguable that in terms of gender relations, many communities in the Northeast were not as patriarchal as in mainland India. I mean, if you look at mainland India, I can say absolutely squarely that the two dominant religious and social traditions, namely Hinduism and Islam, were and are extremely patriarchal in theory and in practice. Not just in theory in terms of scripture, and in practice. Now, it's arguable that in some communities, not in many communities, there wasn't. Now, has modern politics changed this? What does militarization do? What does the spread of arms do? I mean, that your wonderful example of the village lady who said, you came for food, I gave it. You asked for my son, I gave it. But you signed an accord, didn't ask me. Now, does militarization, and also the electoral process, the modern process of representative democracy, not traditional. For example, in Meghalaya, it's only Khasi men who fight elections, by and large. Okay. So, what does armed conflict and modern representative democracy do in making a society more patriarchal? Okay. Now, it is paradoxical, but some of this could be happening. I mean, again, I raise these as questions. I mean, because it could be argued that many parts of the Northeast did not have the baggage of religions like Islam and Hinduism, which are so unbelievably patriarchal. But the process of entering the modern nation state, the process of fighting wars, the process of militarization, of fighting elections. I mean, and this is actually something quite interesting. Because if you look across India, fighting elections increasingly depends on the gathering of money and the mobilizing of manpower, and women get excluded. I mean, you find in states like Karnataka, for example, the proportion of women representatives in Karnataka is historically a progressive. Comparatively in South India, it's relatively progressive. Women in the assembly, women in cabinet is all disappearing. And of course, armed conflict will only accelerate that. This is again a question for us to consider.
Yes, please. It's a free flowing. Please go ahead.
Taking the cue from Ram, I would like to add about patriarchy, gender in the Northeast. Actually, only I think 3 days ago, there was a news item in one of the local papers where Khasi chiefs from Meghalaya or headmen had met to discuss the High Court judgment. The High Court had given a judgment that the Darbar Snongs or the traditional structures of power do not have legal authority. They are mainly, customary powers. Now, I go back to the creation of Nagaland state. That's the beginning I would like to begin with. That when the Nagaland state was created by the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, there was a particular amendment where it said land and its resources belong to the Naga people. And the customs and laws prevalent would be constitutionally recognized. This is a very important point, and I feel that this is the beginning of expanding the parameters of Indian nationalism and also the parameters of the Indian Constitution. This is the first time it happened. It also was incorporated later in the Mizo Accord. Now, taking the cue from that, I think the Naga male leadership has refused, women's participation in the traditional assemblies. They said that the Constitution has guaranteed us, as you said, that did the Constitution bring in patriarchy? I think it's just the opposite. Now they are saying that the Constitution has given us right over our customary laws and women don't figure at all in decision-making process. So they have moved the High Court. They've gone to the Guwahati High Court. And the first ruling of the High Court was that you are right, the Constitution has given it. And that's why you don't have women's participation in the traditional bodies. And when customary law is being codified in Arunachal, and I'm involved partly with that, it is being codified in other places, and this codification process is further going to, be anti-gender in the process, because you are accepting a situation which is not at all, conducive to equality of the sexes. So this is again a situation that needs, this is just by way of explanation to you. The second point which I want to make about what you talked, it's very relevant about asymmetry in resources. Actually, if you go through most of the documents of the insurgent outfits in the northeastern region, one of the major arguing points is that this region is a colonial hinterland. It's a colonial hinterland of India. Today there's relative peace in some of the states, but as someone who has been observing the developments, I think if this attitude of the government of India does not change regarding exploitation of resources, there could come a time, once again, when the main thesis of the region being colonially exploited could become again a political agenda, which the central government will find it very, very difficult to oppose, and the level of the mindset. And thirdly, about Sanjoy, I would like to say about accords. I largely agree with him, excepting, I think, on the Mizo Accord, which I thought did bring, that was the only exception, that did bring an end to armed insurgency in Mizoram and the involvement of former insurgents in the electoral process, because Lal Denga became the first chief minister, and then the process has continued. I think there are a lot of undercurrents, subtexts to it, but still I think it's an exception. But regarding the others, I think they are primarily ad hoc arrangements to prevent the immediate fighting that is going on. That's what I would like.
Before I throw it open, if any of you wants to comment on something which you agree, disagree with, or want to add?
Well, perhaps following up on that, I think we tend to talk about the Northeast in terms of ethnic labels and thinking about closed communities. But these communities nowadays are political projects, I think, and it would be very good to try and develop thought about how to think about the Northeast beyond this, to see, say, movements across the region, to be very sensitive to when you talk about a particular ethnic label, whether this is a recent invention, who benefits from it. And what strikes me in this region is that actually ethnic grouping is such a dynamic thing. It's going on all the time. Quite unlike other parts of India, where in many places these labels seem to be fairly static and well accepted. Again, if you look at the case of the mesos, I mean, this is fascinating place where nobody actually knows what the right label is, how people should call themselves, and there's huge discussions about, you know, sort of competition of existing political projects, one being miso, another being zo, another being zomi, and many other smaller groups. So actually it seems that the realities of at least this part of the Northeast are much more fluid than academics and policymakers allow for.
Yeah, I'm also, you know, I remember a conversation with Mr. Fizo's brother when he had come to negotiate with the government of India in the 70s. So he kept talking about Eastern Nagaland. I said, what is Nagaland? He said, that's Western Nagaland. I said, what is Eastern Nagaland? He said, that's in Burma. You know, so for him, it was a very simple division. And I talk about this because the Naga movement is the oldest of all the movements. One would say that perhaps it is the most democratic, etc. It's the most democratic society, that's what they say. In the most democratic society, women don't inherit. In any tribe, they don't inherit. So is it democratic? Is it patriarchal? Is it not? You know, what Udayon was talking about, in the case of the Naga women led by Rosemary Duchu and others, the Naga Mothers Association, they've moved the High Court and the Supreme Court saying that women have the right to be elected and to choose who they can. So they are actually taking the discourse beyond the immediate and the customary to the Constitution, saying that we have a constitutional right. In that process, they are saying we are Indians, which very few Nagas will say. So we have the right to access. That's why I say when Delhi is the 9th state, we have a right to access the privileges, powers, services, and also work here, you know, and do whatever we need to do. That's one thing. The other point on the whole conversation of women, gender issues, patriarchy and so on is that women are at the front line of every agitation, but they're never in the negotiating process. Never.
Front line, but not the leadership.
They're not the leadership in the negotiation process. You will see that everywhere. There will be, you know, Iram Sharmila, who we all respect, usually is on fast.
Yes.
But when the Mera Paipis want to take over her agenda, she resists. Yes, because she has a personal life that she wants to lead. So there are many complexities in this. And the other thing I wanted to just mention very, very briefly was, this came out again in a morning conversation here in this room, is that the most vulnerable in times of conflict are women and children. And there is not a single counseling center, I think there are 2 perhaps, in the whole of the Northeast, despite the fact we have had 60 years of conflict. You know, how do people cope? The Mizo story is an extraordinary story of resilience, because people have come to a certain internal peace and resolution of this problem, because in the last 10 years they've started to write about it, speak about it and so on. But in the others, which are perhaps more well documented than the Naga and Manipur, than the Mizo story, which is the Naga, Assam and Manipur situations, you don't find this issue coming up at all of how do women especially cope. I remember talking to a group of women during the research we were doing on the impact of conflict on women in Peren district, and the person said, she's talking after 50 years after the army came to the village and burnt it. Who do I go to for justice? To the person who attacked our house? He represents something. For them also, that is a representation. No? It's not just the uniform. It is what the uniform represents. And I think the question of justice and the question, and the question of counseling precede everything else. because people must have a sense that they are going to find justice in the system, whether it's democratic or undemocratic or whatever it is. If there is time, I'll just add one point in the, time and again, I think in this conference, the issue of the Boro situation has come up. Udayon knows it far better than me and any of us really, and I would wait for his word on this. But after 20 years of getting hammered, the non-Boro groups, which include Muslims of Bengali origin, Assamese, it included other tribal groups, scheduled castes, formed an alliance called the Oboro Alliance, essentially association, non-Boro. And they selected a former leader of Ulfa to be their candidate in the Lok Sabha election. He won by the biggest margin, I think, in the whole of Assam, one of the biggest in India. And he wiped out all the other candidates lost their deposits, including the official Boro thing. Now, this tells us there's a very interesting narrative here about scale. The Boros are a minority, at 28%, maybe not even that, of that area. Can a minority wield political power, wield economic power, and hold the power of life and death? I'm talking about the political group which is elected, virtually hold the power of life and death through the weapons that they have on a majority. So the Northeast is really very difficult to address, even whether administratively, even conceptually, I think, because it is a region of large minorities. There are no great majorities. It's unlike any other part of this country.
We're open to the floor. Please identify yourself and please be brief. We can leave it open for about 10 minutes and then come back for please. Just both.
Professor Guha and to others also. Something that...
Identifies.
Okay, I'm Kishaloy Bhattacharjee. I'm a journalist, an author, and I've covered Northeast for a fairly long time. I always had this problem of the word Northeast, the term Northeast. So when we reimagine India's Northeast, should we start now identifying, because Central India, which you say that has one homogeneous character. We say the Adivasis, though there are several tribes and sub-tribes, but there is when I try and identify the problems of India's Northeast, it's not homogeneous. The problem of Arunachal Pradesh is absolutely nothing to do with what is in Meghalaya. So would you like to see it in a different way and reimagine it in a different way? And the second thing, of course, is not a question, but what you mentioned about the patriarchy and gender and conflict has actually now, we have evidence of it because in the previous census, the female feticide map has entered Northeast for the first time, and there are 2 blocks in Nagaland where there is female feticide that has been recorded.
The second thing is extremely worrying. These are convenient labels, And when you say South, do the Kannadigas want to be clubbed with the Tamils? Forget it. All right. So I don't think, you're beyond a point. The South, for example. What is South? I mean, if you look at Karnataka, right? The Tulu speakers, the Konkani speakers, the Marathi speakers, the Urdu speakers, the Dakkani speakers, the Tamil. In Bangalore, where I live, I tell you a story about Bangalore. Bangalore is the only city in the world where you have 6 daily films in 6 languages. All right. So, and it's the capital of a linguistic state called Karnataka. So I think these are problems in India. So you have to go beyond the label. You can, for the moment, you can accept it because it's I'm glad I'm glad NEFA is called Arunachal or not NEFA because you can't call a state by a direction, right? Okay, you can't say Northeast and so on. So, and for the same reason, I'm glad that NWFP in Punjab has become Pakhtunkhwa because that also. But I think of course, we must, and one of the tasks of this center, which it is fulfilling admirably, not just through this session, but also through its research, is to unpack the differences, the diversities. And if you just listen to Udayon speak, you can understand why Arunachal is more sympathetic to being seen as part of India than maybe parts of Manipur. And you can learn from this. So, I don't think we should, of course, it is a problem. But you see, just to say it's a problem shared, I mean, the South is also a description, I mean, and certainly South Indians in Delhi are the Madrasi hai, once upon a time, it was Madrasi hai. I suppose Northeast, the Greater Assam was, seen as Assamese, and then everything else was left out. I don't have a profound objection to it because it's just a beginning. And if it's a beginning that, if the label makes you understand the asymmetries, not the differences, but the asymmetries, and there's a difference between difference and asymmetry. If you just see it as difference, then in fact the difference then leads to the asymmetries, which are cultural and political and ecological. But I myself don't have I mean, it's just a convenience. It's like the South. I mean, is that.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll just come on.
I think just a small comment on what Ram has said on Kishore's question. I think it's not as simple as just saying South India, because you have an administrative framework to deal with Northeast.
Yeah.
Northeast, I have always called it an elusive construct. It is an elusive construct because it was used earlier in the 1920s by evangelicals to describe the area for the first time. And then it became very important after the reorganization that took place after Meghalaya and other states were formed in 1970. But please don't forget that there is a Northeastern Council, that there is the Government of India, Department of Northeast, that 10% of all the funds go to Northeast. Now when they go that way, I think administratively when you try to see an area in an umbrella connotation, forgetting about the immense complexities and diversities of the region, I think you will end up in problems. And the greatest problem Delhi has faced, I feel, is in tackling the emergency because of the insurgency, because each insurgency has its own dynamics in the region. It's very, very different one from the other. So if you try to tackle it on a common platform, there could be problems. That is what I feel. And the second point, I referred to it in one of my books. In one of the film festivals, All India Film Festivals, Assamese film cinema, which was one of the oldest in India, very old, and the time that was given to cinema from the Northeast was just about 15 minutes. And the main filmmaker from Assam, Bhavendranath Saikia, was quite well known. He just walked out saying that, do you do that to Bengali cinema or other cinema? Because Assamese cinema developed from the 1920s. So that is what comes in the way when you see a region as an administrative unit. Otherwise, when people talk about South India or Northeast, no problem with us. But when the government starts viewing it that way and ordering out its policies on that way, I think there could be problems. That's what I feel.
I'll come to us.
Just three very quick points. One is, I think it
Use the mic.
Just use mine.
Come up.
We're recording, so.
Sorry. I think it's important to intersect the colonial legacy as regards the Northeast as a resource-rich area and its predatory exploitation with and intersected with the whole question of militarization. That it is in fact militarization that, while it can deter investors, can also make the situation more conducive to predatory exploitation, because there are all kinds of laws in place to restrict people's mobilization, to restrict people's struggles, that what would be considered democratic struggles anywhere else in the country would be regarded as dangerous, high-risk mobilizations. So the importance of intersecting it with militarization. Number two, and just very quickly, I think the Mizo Accord we do regard it as a success story because the possibility of recurrence of violence is practically over or closed. However, if you look at, and there have been enough narratives during this conference itself to suggest that the nature of democracy, the nature of space, of democratic space, of rights, is a very not only a very exclusionary one, but a very oppressive one, that the whole consolidation of this cohesive Mizo identity is constructed on the backs of on the backs of sacrificing rights and of dissent. I don't have time to go into this, so I'm just flagging it, and many of you are experts in this area. The third is the whole issue of gender and ethnicity, an extremely complex one. Women are, and the women of the Northeast are part of these struggles. They are embedded in these struggles. I don't think you can separate them, and in fact, one of the problems in Nagaland has been that the approach to, or the appeal to the High Court and the Supreme Court, and as you very correctly said, in a sense, an implicit affirmation of national policies and the invocation of national reservation policies has created a subtext of different kind of uneasiness, because otherwise you have a gender polarization. But this has complicated things, and I am surprised sometimes when very well-meaning civil society colleagues of mine in Nagaland, who are otherwise with me on all fronts, suddenly, they happen to be men in this context, suddenly become very uneasy about this appeal to national institutions. Then though, in terms of the whole issue, you're absolutely correct. If you look at the landscape of formal politics, representational politics, and as well as traditional politics, it's a desert. There are no women. But what is important is the women are challenging this at every point. And when you said, what does militarization or armed conflict do in terms of reinforcing patriarchy, it also opens up spaces for women. And there's been a lot of literature to suggest that, in fact, public space, that the gendered public-private divide collapses in conflict. And it's actually post-conflict or ceasefire moments that are really critical, because then the gendered public-private divide returns. But women are contesting it in practically every state of the Northeast. And the Nagaland is actually in the forefront. Thank you.
Kishle, I'm sorry. You have to continue to be gallant. Ma'am, please. She needs access to the mic. I think you wanted to ask something. Or you can just step up, whatever. Please come. No, sir, please don't. Please don't move, It's fine. Yeah, please. Just give her the mic. Just speak.
No, there's one more space now. You can sit.
You can now sit. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Good morning to all. I'm a student in Jamia Millia Islamia, and I'm originally from Bombay. So I had no idea about the issues in Northeast. I had few ideas because of education, but throughout this conference, it's been an eye-opener. The questions are coming out from a student's perspective. I was surprised that the papers hardly touched upon the issue of education. Because personally for me, I think education, at least it forms a basis on what you think as children, as we grow up. We grow up with certain prejudices, we grow up with certain perceptions. So personally for me, because of the Maharashtra state, I don't think so Northeast was ever touched upon. But I met a couple of students from the Northeast who were studying in Mumbai, and I was surprised to see a huge population of Northeast students in Delhi. So my point is, the youth today are willing to go outside, step out of their comfort zone, are willing to go to the cities, to study, to explore new avenues. And they are, I think, slightly more open to the mainstream culture of India. They are ready to challenge the mainstream culture of India. And personally, my roommate is from Assam. And whenever I ask her about, the kind of history, the history that I've studied is very different from the history that she has studied. So I asked her, what's the difference? And she said that the teachers there reinforce this behavior that is slightly like alienated, or behavior that is something that they do not connect to the Indian identity. They consider themselves separate from the Indian identity. And that itself is passed down to the students there. So one of the papers also touched upon how the different ethnic identities, and they have their own languages. So, the language that the main state education is passing down. Again, there is a site of conflict. So, yeah, my question is, how do you think an education help in changing these perceptions? And, you know, because that itself is a structural conflict, a cause for structural conflict. Thank you.
Professor, very distinguished Vice Chancellor and anthropologist, I think we must get you to comment on this and other issues.
Actually, I'm on sabbatical from academics for almost 2.5 years now, and I have lost contact with academics. I just had a couple of things. One is a most superstitious comment. Has it got something to do with the word Northeast? Because if you see Sri Lanka, the entire conflict zone was Northeast Sri Lanka. Look at Bhutan. Because of Chinese occupation, the problem is brewing up in Northeast Bhutan, and you have similar problems in Northeast Nepal. So I was wondering at some point of time whether something has got to do with this word Northeast, and maybe we need to change the name of our region, and maybe we will be better. The other thing is about that Willem talked about invisibility of the other space where we are not. If we are in Bangladesh, then Northeast becomes invisible. I was wondering whether we could also start thinking about invisible peoples within the Northeast when we are Northeast. And when somebody writes a book on Manipur, nobody talks about the Bengalis, the Nepalis, or Marwadis living there for ages. And similarly about Meghalaya and Assam too, in fact. So the invisible people within the region, I was wondering whether this would also receive some attention. And finally about Ram talking about gender and patriarchy, I was wondering, because there's a very clear, I would say, line between the wheat producing areas and the rice producing areas. Whether wheat production and rice production have something to do with greater or lesser patriarchy or not, I think needs to be further investigated by young scholars. Because wheat producing areas probably have lesser role for women and therefore is more patriarchal than rice producing areas, including South India, in fact, Madrasism including. Thank you.
One sec. There's a gentleman right there. I'll come back to us. Yeah, please use the mic and please introduce yourself. I'll come to you.
Thank you. I'm Rajesh. I'm a researcher. I missed the first part of the conversation, but in the second part of the conversation, I want to comment in two contexts. Like many scholars are very happy to say that I'm little knowledge of the Northeast. In fact, actually it needs to be changed. And another thing is that, another thing is like as Ram said that about the all these nation making process is violent in US. This it shows that it indirectly says that okay, now we are trying to make a building, so this militarization is a part of the national process. So it justifies.
That's not what I meant.
Even in the case of and in the case of India, only Jallianwala Bagh was the one case. You have a bloodshed. But in India, in the last 50 years, in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Nagaland, so it becomes bloodshed. And one needs to be very careful. And about the Sanjoy's comment on Delhi is a 9th state of Northeast. But recently, very controversial remark from BJP, about the immigrant issue. The issue is that Northeast is a very diverse issue and many have reacted differently. Like in Assam, many people disappointed, but many people said that at least BJP learned history of the region.
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you, Mahesh. Well, the point that I'm to make partly would be related to what this young lady had just said. I was trying to look at the crowd here, and I actually come from Assam myself, more about 35 years back. And I can see that one of the positive fallouts of the Assam movement or the insurgency in the Northeast was that a large number of students actually came out of Assam and to study because they were not able to get right kind of education, their atmosphere. And I think this is the time